Yes, it is. It is my great honor to introduce our presenter. I've only known her for 2 days and I have already learned so much from interacting with her. I think you guys are going to have a fantastic experience today and come away with some really practical and useful suggestions that you can apply in your classroom in a meaningful way. Laura Buzis started her career in the Schenectady City School District and is now a principal for Ravenna Queenman Selkirk Middle School. Take it away, Laura.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for coming. So actually, I just wanted to start off by giving you an overview of some of the goals that we hope to accomplish in our time together, but I will try to meet some of your needs that I may not know yet as they appear in the chat, and Amanda sort of helps me out with that. This is my 27th year in education, and I started my career as a curriculum coordinator for Broome Tioga BOCES at the high school level. I then taught at Mount Pleasant Middle School for a portion of my career and eventually became a school principal. I was a literacy coach and an instructional coach in between that time as well. And all of those changes were really scary, right? We're all getting so used to living in a time of change and the unexpected during that, like now more than ever, we're all having to face immense changes. But every one of those changes that I made in my career in the moment was quite a scary experience, but as it turned out to be, ended up being the best teachers to me, all those changes. So as I reflect now and think about school-wide systems and classroom management systems that I learned and implemented throughout my career in my different roles, I've come to kind of a new understanding of how they can all work together. And so our first goal is to blend the three common approaches around PBIS, responsive classroom, and restorative practices, and kind of hoping to sort of change our thinking around punishment. I do want to be clear, however, because one of the criticisms, especially that restorative practice might get, is that, oh, there's no accountability, there's no consequences. Students will never learn not to repeat those behaviors because they're not being given consequences for the behavior. And I want to make sure that I weave accountability and consequences into the presentation so you see that that is not a flaw of restorative practices. That's more of a flaw in our own approach to it if we fail to weave that in. I'm going to give you a brief overview of each of these approaches in practice. And then I'd like to discuss with you the behaviors that most impede your ability to move forward in your school or your classroom or whatever your role might be, so we can brainstorm responses to those behaviors. So those are our goals. And I already have a task for you. And because we can't do this workshop quite traditionally how we would if we were in person, I wanted you to do these warm-ups as stop and jots and then put them into the chat if you feel comfortable doing so and you want to share your ideas. I may not be able to share out all of them. Amanda will try to be strategic, but if you feel comfortable sharing, please do. And so any of you who've participated in a restorative circle, a community building circle, there's several different types of circles that you might run, but for our purposes, we're looking at what a community building circle might do. The first round is typically some type of like temperature check or something really positive to set the tone of the circle, something. So I wanted to ask you to be thinking about, just to set the tone and get you thinking about some positivity, what is the silver lining that you have noticed or discovered during our pandemic that would give you something to celebrate? And how might you take that back to your classroom or whatever your role in school might be? What is a silver lining that you found? And then the second thing that I'd like you to jot is just to take about 3 minutes. So we'll give this a total of 5 minutes to jot as many challenging behaviors as you can think of and then rank them. And I want you to think about what irritates you personally, because when we're irritated or annoyed at a behavior that a student is demonstrating, it is much more difficult to be responsive. It's easier to be reactive because we all have an Achilles heel, right? And spending many of my years of my career with middle schoolers, my husband says I started to act like a middle schooler. I think that part, I come home with a lot of jokes and sayings that my kids say, but also they know what irritates us, and they may intentionally sometimes bring those behaviors out. So I want you to rank them from what irritates you most to least and come up with as many as you can. And then we'll set this aside and use that later. You have about 4 more minutes to do this task. Thank you so much. And I'll be quiet so you can do it.
So Laura, just to clarify, the round one response is going to go in the chat and the round two will just keep a list on paper for later in the session?
And you don't have to put it in the chat. I just thought if someone found something especially exciting and they did want to share with the group, that would be wonderful. But if you don't want to put your silver lining in the chat, that's okay too. And if you think about this in the context of restorative circles, that's typically one of the norms that we would tell students, is that they can pass. So I could see that the chat does appear, but it goes away very quickly because I'm sharing my screen. But I saw a lot of comments about silver linings, being able to spend time with your family. It was like newfound time with your family. It looks like someone had a baby. So congratulations. That's amazing and exciting, but probably really nerve-wracking for you too. So so much resiliency. And we have a lot of resiliency in our field as well. So I just wanted you to be able to sort of set your mind to some of the positivity, because I do think as it pertains to school, there are quite a few silver linings. One of them in my district was that we learned, even though we were thrust into it, to become quite savvy virtual educators. So teachers that maybe were not the most adept at Google Classroom became very skilled. We kind of band together to match our strengths. So my real tech savvy teachers who were, quite tech forward before the pandemic were really great about supporting the teachers who were not, and our community came together. So as you think about the silver linings, I hope you sort of keep that in the front of your mind for this presentation, because I want you to also think about the opportunities and possibilities as it pertains to common approaches around PBIS, responsive classroom, and restorative practices. One of the criticisms of PBIS, and you've probably, depending on where you are in your career, lived through different versions of PBIS. You've probably seen it rise and then fall and then maybe rise again, or you've probably experienced celebrations, but maybe not the rest of the parts of PBIS that all need to happen. And I think a criticism of PBIS, there's a couple things that I wanted to talk to you about. If you are in a building that doesn't fit the traditional tiered triangle, that's hard, because this notion that 85% of your students will be at tier one, that means that 85% of your students, a typical PBIS approach will be successful with. But as you know, many of our buildings, that typical triangle of 85, 10, 5% at tier three is not always the case. We often have more students at the tier two and tier three level than that traditional triangle shows. And it makes it more challenging. And PBIS really, it does have the ability to deal with tier two and tier three, but we're not always as intentional about that work. So I want you to think about the parts of PBIS just for a minute, and feel free to stop and jot these in your notes. The parts of PBIS that really worked in your experience, and the parts of PBIS that you thought maybe didn't work, or things that were missing. For me, the tier two and tier three parts of PBIS were missing. I think about behavior as a skill. I spent a good portion of my career trying to unlock the reading mystery. When I was working with a student who was a struggling reader and they were already middle school age, I would grow increasingly frustrated. Like, what's the mystery? What are they missing? What part of the reading system do they need to overcome this hurdle that they're experiencing as a reader? Because everything in school is frustrating if reading is a challenge, because so much of what we do is reading based. Now I'm thinking the same way about behavior. I'm always trying to unlock the mystery and understand what the need is. What is the need that the student is expressing in their behavior, so that I can better respond at the tier 2 and tier 3 levels. So for me, PBIS was about, and I'll say a second big criticism of it was the debate between folks who think intrinsic motivation is critical, and that extrinsic motivation is not the right approach. However, when you think about some of the behaviors, if you take a scan over at the list and you list the behaviors that you found most irritating, probably some of them are connected to your perceived view of the student not being motivated or engaged or connected to the work that you're doing with them. And that can be very frustrating. You're so passionate about something, you want that passion to be contagious, and a student has their head down or their hood up or they're sleeping or some other behavior that shows that you don't see them as very engaged. That can be very challenging. Can motivation be taught? Think about that for a second. If you believe that motivation, as I do, can be taught, can you teach intrinsic motivation through extrinsic motivators? If you believe that you can, it's like any great behavior plan. You have the motivators in there, you have the rewards in there until you slowly don't need them as often or at all at some point. And PBIS allows that for the students who don't come to us already loaded with intrinsic motivation. So I wanted you to think about that for a second. Then we move on to responsive classroom and restorative practices. If PBIS offers a school-wide approach, then responsive classroom and restorative practices offer layers of the parts that I believe are missing from PBIS. Responsive classroom allows us to address tier 2, and restorative practices does as well. And they also both allow us to address tier 3. And so I'll get into that a little bit more when we move on to that. On the outside, you look at traditional consequences. You've probably heard before about consequences that are punishments, and folks feeling as though if that's missing, the students are not going to learn their lesson. So think about the traditional consequences. For me, unless they're intervention based and there's a teaching and learning component to them, they don't work, or they don't work for most students, I should say. So getting suspended, for example, doesn't then allow the student to come back cured, if you will, of whatever the reason was that they got suspended in the first place. So I want you to sort of hold traditional consequences on the outside, and in a little bit, we'll talk about consequences that are logical, that can work inside of your classrooms or schools. So if you think of PBIS for a second as structures, rewards, and interventions if we systematically ensure that they're there. And again, I'm going to talk to you about how we can systematically ensure they're there by coupling PBIS with responsive classroom and restorative practices. So the things about PBIS that are structure-based that we have to attend to explicitly and repeatedly have to do with things like voice level systems, hallway procedures, routines that you'd like to see inside of the bathroom, cafeteria expectations, assembly expectations, all of those places where we as educators crave structure, right? And that's probably one of our biggest fears as classroom teachers, is losing control of the classroom, feeling like there's not structure. That can be really challenging. So PBIS allows us to put those structures in place, but like anything, we have to pay careful and critical attention to all the parts, and we have to nurture them in the same way that we would nurture any other skill. So think for a second when you're teaching a skill like inference. You want the students to be able to infer, or, if you're an upper level teacher, you are thinking about a skill around being able to analyze and interpret data and make an informed decision about where to take that data, something like that. Those are critical skills. High level thinking, you would spend a lot of time teaching and reinforcing those skills. You would model it, you would have small group work around it, you would give students actionable feedback, and you would sort of nurture their way through developing that skill. The same thing is true of skills around behavior. We really have to attend to it with the same rigor that we would any academic skill. It's really hard sometimes to not view behavior as willful, or to see a student and say he or she is giving me a hard time. They're making it hard for me to teach. In all reality, if you can flip that script in your mind, the likelihood is that he or she is actually really having a hard time. And that hard time is being represented through behavior. Second part of PBIS are the reward system that you come up with. This can be really challenging. I know when I was doing it, I would forget that I was giving out tickets, or I would have trouble maintaining a reward system so that it actually had value. So you want to make it doable, but just like anything else, you have to have a regular, routine approach to the reward system, especially those school-wide systems. No referral parties. Let's think about that for a second. That can be a really tricky subject. I would have staff who would realize when it came time for the no referral party that a student was on the list to go. That, there weren't students being withheld from that celebration, and it would be frustrating if they felt as though that student hadn't earned the celebration. Again, I'm going to ask you to flip your mindset around that and instead look at it like, how do I get every student to earn that celebration? What does it look like when the entire school celebrates? And so make sure your reward system allows for the teaching and learning. So if I have a reward system that takes things away or is punitive, in other words, you earn this ticket, but now you don't get it anymore because then 10 minutes later you did something else, where does the teaching and learning happen? If you have a system where earning it back is built in, that's your opportunity to actually teach and to model and to reinforce those behaviors that you hope to see. And the last part of PBIS that I think is often missing are the interventions. What happens when the tier 1 school-wide approach doesn't work? And I'm sure you can think of several students in your mind right now where those traditional things I just spoke of are not enough and the student needs more. So I'm going to layer in what that more could look like. But first, I wanted you to take a moment to do another task. So for each of the systems that I'm talking to you about today, there's an easy way for you to do a needs assessment. Here's one way to do a needs assessment for PBIS. Ask yourself 2 questions. The first question is, what structures do you believe need to exist in your school and in your classroom? What are the structures that you would like to see that you think will help both you and your students succeed? The best environment that you can create has these structures living inside of it. Once you've created that T-chart and you have the structures listed, on the right side, you want to think about the rewards that you could offer that you feel most match the structures. So in other words, if the students are meeting the expectations within each of these structures, what does the incentive system look like? You have to make sure that it's doable. You have to make sure that it matches up with what you feel. Like, we have a lot of thinking around food-based rewards. So you want to think about, is that something that you really think is appropriate? And then you want to think about students who might need more or different. Okay, so what rewards or what plans might you have to do that are more individualized for the students that you think the school-wide approach or the whole classroom approach won't work? So I'm going to give you a minute to sort of go through this list for yourself, and I'll give Amanda a minute to address anything that she feels needs to be addressed at this point while you guys are making your T-chart. Amanda, is there anything in the chat that you wanted to address or talk about?
There was a request to just quickly review the 3 tiers. So I entered that into the chat. Tier 1 interventions being interventions that apply to all students equally or school-wide programs. Tier 2, targeted individual or small group interventions for students who need some additional support. And then Tier 3, highly individualized interventions for students who need intensive support. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Laura.
Sure, I'll also add about the timing and how difficult it is. Let's just call it out. When a student needs tier 3 interventions, we usually need to give those interventions to them longer. In other words, a typical intervention plan might be about 6 weeks, and then we'll review the progress. A tier 3 student might need more than 6 weeks before we review the progress. That doesn't mean if it's absolutely not working that you keep doing it. But what I often see happen as it pertains to behavioral interventions is that we give up. It's really hard to stay the course. So you have a student who's exhibiting intensive tier 3 needs as it pertains to social and emotional learning. And sometimes those behaviors can be safety based, right? Like, so you're concerned about the other students in your class. If a student is flipping a desk or they're having outbursts or they're physical with other students. Really challenging. It causes the same response that a student has in fight, flight, or freeze we have, right? Like, am I going to engage this student? Am I going to ignore the behavior? Am I going to, and we feel that same sense of intense anxiety as we're trying to figure out, control, and sort of mediate that situation. When we put a behavior plan in place for those students, it always gets worse before it gets better. And what I'll see happen is staff will say to me, well, it didn't work, so I stopped doing the plan. And it's like, well, you tried it for 2 days. This child, depending on their age and the severity, has learned this habit and has been behaving like this for how long? So it's going to take a long time to flip the script and shift those habits. So it really is a stay the course and get help from your colleagues. Thinking about some of the logical consequences we'll talk about later in the presentation, we can think more about that.
Someone asked if you're at all familiar with the PAX program, PAX, and if that's similar to PBIS.
Yes, I haven't personally used it, but it is a companion. I know that Page Elementary, I don't know if they still are, but when I was in Schenectady, that was a program that they were using. And I would guess that if there's anybody in this presentation that was or is at Page or using PACS, that they could be of assistance if you wanted to know more about it. I personally have never used PACS, but I'm a believer in making our lives easier. So if there is a low cost program, I never think the program is going to fix things, right? Like I used to search for the reading program. Where's the reading program that's going to teach every kid to read? And it doesn't exist. Reading is a system that is requiring many different approaches, and it really is, the good news is it's job security. It really is the teacher. The skill of that teacher is what actually gets the child to read, especially if they're struggling. And they have to pull from a variety of programs so that they're addressing all of the portions of reading, from phonics and phonemic awareness to comprehension and everything in between, vocabulary. There's so much involved in developing a system of reading. Behavior is the same way. So if PACS is something that can make your life easier, then I would say if you can afford it or you already have it, go for it. It really is a lot also about mindset. So if our mindset is such that something's not going to work or something's just layered with problems, then it probably won't work for us. But if our mindset is such that this is powerful and it's going to work, then the chances that it will work increase exponentially. So moving on to responsive classroom, but save your PBIS thinking because we'll want to put all that together in a little bit. So moving on to responsive classroom, a lot of responsive classroom is embedded in what we say. I hope you're hearing the similarities of PBIS. PBIS is a lot about positive reinforcement, right? Positive language, shifting your mindset to focus on what students are doing well rather than our natural tendency to notice what's not going well in the room or the school or the space that you're in with students. So, little quick brief story. My oldest daughter is a camp counselor. She works with 6-year-olds every day. And she comes home and tells me a variety of stories, and I, being her mother, think I have the answers for a lot of the problems that she poses to me that happen at camp. And her, being my 19-year-old daughter, thinks I know nothing. So, that's just to give you a little context. I've been trying to give her some responsive classroom strategies to use with her 6-year-old campers. She said, we're not going to get to do the ropes because they won't be quiet. And I said, well, what do you say when you're to the point where you think you're not going to allow them to do the ropes course? She says, I say to them, if you're not quiet, we won't do the ropes. And I said, and then what happens? Well, they keep talking. And I said, okay, try reinforcing language first. So that is reminding them of the expectations before you're even remotely thinking about doing the ropes, and then ensuring that they have the skill to do the ropes. They have the capacity to be quiet when directed to do so. If you think about this in the context of older students, middle school, high school, where you may not use such an elementary approach, responsive classroom is not just for elementary. It's just a lot of the parts of it feel very elementary to people. Morning meeting feels like a luxury that middle school and high school teachers will say, I don't have the time for that. I push back and say, you don't have the time not to. Because if you don't take care of the relationships in your classroom, you're going to lose instructional time every single solitary day. And often you'll lose way more of it than you would attribute to classroom meetings. So reinforcing is the first thing. So what I said to my daughter was, try reminding them of the expectation using reinforcement. Responsive classroom would say, don't thank them. PBIS says, thank them. It's so habitual for me to say, thank you for your quiet voices. Or like when I'm trying to make an announcement in the cafeteria, I go table to table and I reinforce the expectations. I appreciate your clean table. I love the way you're making eye contact with your lunch monitor, just reinforcing however you feel comfortable. And you want to do that 5 times as often as you're doing anything else. And remember the power of your words, so it's positively stated always. So rather than what my daughter was doing, which was noticing what they were doing wrong and saying it out loud, if you don't stop talking, we're going to, not be able to do the ropes. Notice that and reinforce who isn't talking. And you want to always state that positively. You can also have your students do this. So right now, I'm going to model the expectation, or I'm going to have a student model the expectation, and then I want my class to notice and name what we just did, and then reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. When reinforcing isn't working to support the whole entire class from making that shift to a new expectation, you can move on to reminding language. But again, reminding language is stating positively exactly what you expect. It's without judgment and it's without critique. So it's simple. Right now, I'm looking for level 0 voices. Right now, I'm looking for notebooks open, pencils out, whatever it is that you're hoping to achieve. Redirection comes last. I want you, when you're back into your classrooms, hopefully on some hybrid schedule, if not fully in person. I feel like the middle child because I'm middle school. So we have 3 concurrent schedules for the middle school next year, which is making me very nervous because I inherited 5th grade to keep the density in our buildings down. And 5th grade will run like elementary with 2-person teams if we can swing it, numbers wise. And then 6th grade will be there every day, but run like middle school. Only we're introducing block scheduling for the first time. Why not throw another change out there? And that's to ensure fewer classes and control the school day. And then, of course, I have 7th grade, which is going to be hybrid. So partial in-person, partial remote. And teachers are going to be teaching remotely all the time. So even if they're in person and they have students sitting in front of them, they're also going to have Google Classroom and a Google Meet running so that the students at home can participate as well. So it's a lot of change. And I think what happens is we move to redirections first. We tend to notice right away what we don't want, and we start redirecting the group. Try to keep track or have a colleague do it for you if you're comfortable. That's really powerful. I just make 3-column list and tally the numbers of reinforcing language that you used, the numbers of time you use reminding language, and the numbers of times that you redirected. And the final thing I'll say about redirecting is whenever possible, especially if it's only 1 or 2 students, do it privately. We as adults, did you ever get the scolding email, but you didn't do it? So you get that everybody email that scolds you, but you're actually the teacher that followed the directions and did everything you were supposed to. How does it feel when you get that scolding email if you've actually met the expectation? It feels really, really annoying is my guess, and frustrating, and maybe makes you angry because you're thinking, I followed the direction, and not only do I not get noticed, I don't get that reinforcement that I'm looking for as a human being that I did what you asked me to do, but I'm being redirected when I'm not the person that needs the redirect. So rather than giving your entire class the redirection, unless most of the students need the redirect, try to give it individually and privately to the greatest degree possible. And the last thing I'll say about this before we move on is logical consequences. And I'm going to have you draw another T-chart that we hopefully can bring together in a moment around consequences. So all logical consequences mean is the consequences connected to the misbehavior. So, and it has to connect to teaching, modeling, and then reinforcing. So the consequence can't be you lose recess because you were talking in line, because those aren't connected. Unless the loss of recess is going to be the reteach of the expectations in line. But a logical consequence for line behavior might be a specific line spot for that student. And you give them the expectations with modeling to then not have to have that line spot anymore. So you're very clear with them. This is what's expected in line, model exactly what's expected in line, and then have them have that special line spot. And then when they're ready, they show you that they've now been able to manage the line expectations, so they no longer have that spot. And think about that in terms of older students and the things that might make it difficult to teach behaviors that they're demonstrating. And what's logical? So when I assign any type of consequence to a student, I ensure that there's going to be an adult that's actually going to teach, model, and reinforce the expectations. And as soon as that student shows readiness, that consequence ends and they go back into the fold so that they can then show us the expectations that they just learned. So think about that for a second and draw another T-chart. And on this T-chart, I want you to think on the one side about administrator consequences. What are the consequences that administrators have at their disposal? And then on the other side, I want you to think about teacher consequences and list all the consequences you feel, if you are a teacher or if you're not, that you imagine that teachers have at their disposal. And just make that list and set it aside. So again, you want to think about, what do I, as an administrator, if you're in that role, or what does your administrator, if you aren't in that role, have at their disposal in terms of consequences for student behavior? What do you as a teacher or a staff member, or if you're not in that role, use your imagination of what they have at their disposal for consequences. And Amanda, I'll pause if there's anything you want to address while they're making that T-chart.
No, nothing new in the chat yet, so we'll just give them a minute.
Okay. So while you're making your list, I will share with you some of the middle school challenges in my role now. Hoods, cell phones, and a lot of power struggles. You think about the typical 11, 12, 13-year-old that finds themselves in middle school. Maybe you even remember your own middle school experience. A lot of people say that middle school was a hard time in their lives. Many adults will say that. And many middle school teachers got in the field simply because they wanted to be part of supporting students and navigating this time in their lives that can be really challenging for us as human beings. And so when I think about consequences, I often have to shift some of the responsibility back to the teacher, not because I don't want to handle it, not because I don't care, not because I don't recognize and understand the teacher's frustrations. None of those things are actually true, but because if the student will do it for me, that does not mean that they will then go back the next day and do it for that teacher. So if we don't partner on the consequence piece and we don't partner on the teaching and learning piece, the problem tends to linger. And so then they come down to my office and they say things like, "Can I just stay here for social studies?" No, you actually cannot stay in my office where you won't be instructed on social studies. You have to go back to social studies, and it becomes sort of, I'm sure you've had the similar experience if you have an in-school placement or some type of other chillville or calming room that students go to when they've been either they've self appointed themselves to that space or because you've asked them to leave. If that teaching doesn't happen, that problem is going to linger. So again, folks will say, "I don't have time." I would argue back, you don't have time not to unless you're good with this problem hanging out for a really long time. So restorative practices came along as a way for us to address some of this teaching and learning around behavior. Some of the principles include proactively building strong relationships among all stakeholders. We do community circles as a faculty and staff. We do them regularly, and we talk a lot about the types of things that are happening inside our classrooms that are making it challenging. And then we give a chance for people to chart or offer up the things that they've had success with so that then the teachers can later on work together to problem solve some of those difficulties that are happening. I think this second bullet is critical to understand. Go back for a second to your list of irritating behaviors. You got that one that most bothers you on top because I asked you to rank them. When that happens, your relationship with that child has been damaged. And because we're human beings, it's easy to make that argument one of righteousness because you're probably right, right? You are the adult. So in all likelihood, you're right. What you asked was reasonable and how you're feeling is just. However, the student will unlikely be the hero in your relationship. You will likely always have to be the hero, the heroic one in that relationship. And for whatever reason, when your relationship is damaged, it will continue to go down the tubes if you don't address it. And restorative practices gives you a healthy way to repair that relationship. This can happen in small group if it involves groups of students, but it can also happen with that child. In our case, we started a leadership team, so I often bring an ally for that child, so a peer that's going to participate in a harm circle. I often bring an adult that the student has identified they want to be a part of their plan moving forward. Obviously, the teacher whose relationship has been damaged would participate, and I would only do that upon their agreement. And then sometimes you might have a counselor, or sometimes it's difficult for me to be the circle keeper in a harm circle because I am likely the person that gave the consequence if an administrative consequence is involved in the scenario. So I might just participate in the circle as well as someone who wants to be part of the plan. And often one of the questions we ask is, what do you need? And it's true of the student, but it's also true of the teacher. So we're seeking for mutual understanding. What does the teacher need? And how has that need not been met? And how can the student actually work with the teacher to meet that need? But it also asks the student, what do you need? And sometimes it's really small things that the teacher can change so that those mutual needs are met. Instead, what happens when you don't address this is you and the student are going to have competing needs. And that will always cause the power struggle when your needs compete with the needs of the student. If their need is attention, for example, they're going to compete with you to get that attention when you're trying to give the entire class directions or something like that. And the final bullet is around identifying the root causes of the adverse behaviors and strategies and needs that will allow you to change them. Within a harm circle, those root causes can be identified if you're strategic about the questions you ask. So now think about this, another T-chart. And do you see, I hope you're able to see how easy these needs assessments are. It's just a simple, comparing and contrasting of what needs to happen inside of the space. So if you think about what student behaviors do you need to see inside of a restorative circle and what teacher behaviors, and I'm going to give you a few because I don't even know that I'm going to have you take the time to do this T-chart, but I just wanted to show it to you. So maybe later when you're going back in and saying, how am I going to implement restorative practices in a more thorough way? If you are already, you might just be trying to add to your practice. If you haven't yet, this would be a great thing for you to do. Then think about the teacher behaviors. And I know this is hard, but usually what results when we're working on behavior plans and we're looking at changing behaviors is the teacher has to change. And it's not in a place of judgment or because that teacher is wrong. It's simply because what you're doing isn't working. It's not working for you either. So therefore, you have to really be cognizant of what teacher behaviors do I need to make this a success. So inside of a restorative circle, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, because I actually made this mistake. So just a quick story. I was doing a harm circle with a student who was refusing to go to a class. And it was a quarterly class. So the more refusals, the more likely that student would not be able to pass the class because they were never going. And so I was spending a lot of time with the student and talking to them about, why they wouldn't go to class, like what was it about the space? They were really, really upset with the teacher. They felt that the teacher was unfair, that the teacher didn't listen to them, and that the teacher blamed them and assumed that the behavior was them when they weren't even the one that did the behavior. And so I pushed too quickly, as is often the case with me. I'm go, 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 1,000 miles an hour. I pushed too quickly and pulled together a circle without really delving in with the teacher to ensure that the teacher was ready and willing and had wanted the desired outcome, the same desired outcome as I did and as the student did, that things were going to be better and that we were going to progress with a new and improved plan. So we're sitting in the circle, we're doing rounds, and when it got to the round of what do you think the student needs? What does Logan need? And Logan said he needed to be heard. He kind of went into this little example of how he felt as though whenever he had something to say, it wasn't taken seriously or it was ignored. And then, the different adults participating each said what they thought he needed. And then when it got to the teacher and the teacher was asked, what do you think Logan needs? He said, I think Logan needs to listen to me. So I was like, I missed the mark on that one. So you have to think about, what do you need as a teacher going into a circle? If you're still really angry at the behavior, you're still feeling, maybe it's a safety thing and you don't feel safe. It's not a good time for you to go into that circle. And you want to be honest with that. And you want to wait until you get to a place where you feel like you can go into that circle ready. So I'll move on. I just made for you a brief list of the things that you would need to implement restorative practices. So I'll give you a second. I won't read this slide to you to just kind of look over this slide. And I'll speak briefly about a few of the things to give you some context. So what I was talking about before would have been resolved if I had respect agreements. When you do circles, because we're always in a hurry and because we want the problem to be resolved quickly, we often don't slow down enough to do the work that needs to happen around respect agreements. Think about respect for a second. It means something totally different. When you're in a circle, you'll see that not everybody defines respect the same. So you can build respect agreements together and collectively by having circle rounds where you talk about, what does respect look and sound like to me? What do I need to feel respected in the space? What do you need to feel respected in the space? And then collectively create that list, and that list then can become your norms. If you're familiar with the parts of responsive classroom, that sounds a lot like hopes and dreams. If you're familiar with PBIS, that sounds a lot like collectively and democratically posting your classroom expectations. So you see how none of these things have to be in competition with one another. You can really partner them for the most success. But restorative practices allows you to dive deeper with those tier 2 and tier 3 students. So I'll give you a second to just sort of notice the last bullet. Often another stakeholder that we can be in competition with, which is so sad because they're really our biggest ally, they're our biggest support. If we have a partnership with them, we're 20 times more likely to succeed, and that's parent trainings. So, and parents, when I first started to do circles with groups of parents, were so uncomfortable, partially because they didn't yet have trust in the process, I think, but partially because in their educational experience, no one had ever done anything like that with them. And some of the parts of restorative practice can be misunderstood as like the frou-frou, right? Like if you're going to do mindfulness in a restorative circle, people who are yet to wrap their minds around that being an effective practice might, say, oh, restorative circles, there's no accountability. There is so much more accountability in a harm circle than there is in a suspension, because ultimately you come up with a new way of being for the teacher and the student that you hold that student accountable to. And so sometimes in the harm circle, vaping for a second, like when we do a harm circle about vaping, or worse, selling vape pods or liquid in the bathroom. That's when inside of the harm circle, that student A has to own the harm that has occurred based on their action. And that becomes crystal clear in the circle. So you can now kind of understand why everybody has to be on the same page, including the student. Harm circles don't work if some of the parties are unwilling. They can be hesitant, they can be skeptical, but they have to be willing to push through the process. And they have to be open to the solutions that will reveal themselves in the process. It's really scary to be a circle keeper at first because there's a lot of unknowns. The circle could go in the wrong direction, and you have to be okay with the messiness if you are the circle keeper. But in doing a harm circle for something like vaping, first and foremost, they have to own the harm they're doing. And then embedded in that process is, what do you need? Often what's revealed is they need to understand the depth of the harm that they're causing when they're either choosing to vape, or worse, they're choosing to sell the vaping liquid or pods inside of, and I'm not saying that some of the traditional consequences might not be coupled with it. You all have codes of conduct, or you might have codes of conduct, or, student handbooks, or, district expectations. There's legalities to some of what I'm talking about when it gets to the higher level of consequences that we're talking about. A lot of schools moved away from school resource officers. We moved towards it, but we allow them to participate in the restorative practice portion of things because we want there to be agreements of respect between the school resource officer and the families. We want to improve community relations. And so restorative practices helps to do that. They begin to see the school resource officer as an ally and a community resource rather than this enemy that they shouldn't trust. So ultimately, the consequence of suspension may live inside of something like a harm circle, but within that suspension, it's very likely modified to something like a structured day. I very rarely do full-on suspensions anymore. I will do a structured day. And so I want to take a minute just to tell you what that is. So if you're in a position to give consequences, you might start to think about how you could offer a structured day. And if you're not in a position to give consequences like that, you may advocate for a structured day for your students. So rather than removing the student altogether, A structured day allows them for some teaching and reinforcement in a separate location with the right person, and then a reintegration into the day. So sometimes I'll say to students, what classes are you most worried about missing? Or what classes, if you miss them, will have the greatest effect on your average or your ability to move forward? And as long as I have the teacher agreement, they may go to those classes, but with guidelines. I'll give them a visual schedule, and on the schedule, it'll show them the places where they're going to have to do some other training. So when it's vaping, it's training with the health teacher, it's some conversation with the nurse, it's online platform that we're using for vape education, things of that nature. Think about the logical consequence list that you made before and how you could build those logical consequences into a structured day. So if you structure the student's day rather than suspending them where you have no control, right? You suspend them. If it's in school suspension, I don't even know what they do. They sit in a room all day, maybe. If it's out of school suspension, they go home, where you don't have control over what's happening. And in all likelihood, the relationship is harmed. It's not going to get better. If you don't reintegrate when they come back to school, that harm will continue to get worse. So think about those items for a second, and I will move on. And I'll also give Amanda a chance because we're nearing the end of time. Correct, Amanda?
8 minutes left. Yep.
So I did put something at the end of this that we're not going to have time for, and that's okay because I'm giving you my contact information if you want to reach out. But I did want to briefly talk to you about what we're doing. And so as a middle school, probably mid-year, so when I became the principal, there was no PTSO or PTO or PTA, whatever you're calling it. And that made me so sad. It's like, where's the partnership? And I know that happens logically over time, like elementary PTOs tend to be a lot more active than middle, and then high school, it's almost non-existent. But I wanted to have something different. I knew that without parents as partners, things were going to be a lot harder for us. So we started a PTSO. I have a student leadership team. I so recommend that to you. And restorative practices can be part of the process. And I don't care what level you're in. You can be in elementary, you can be in middle, you can be in high school. If you're in high school, consider the student leadership team to be the leaders that support the middle school training. If you're in a middle school, consider building student leadership team that then supports the elementary. And if you're in the elementary, those upper elementary students could certainly support the primary students. And let me tell you, the students listen to the high school students like they never listened to me. So it's very empowering. When the high school students come and talk about their experiences and participate in a circle, it's like, oh, I said that same thing 19 times and none of them heard me. But this high school student who looks cool and who they can look up to said it once and they listened. So it's amazing the power, and it feels really good to be a student on the leadership team. Students so look forward to that opportunity. So inside of the leadership team, some of those students are on the building leadership team as representatives, and they're also on the PTSO. So there are S in the PTSO, if you will, and so powerful. Their voices, their input around PBIS, extremely powerful. We all listen when they speak because they have a lot to say, and what they say it makes a lot of sense. They know a lot more than if we don't give them the opportunity for that voice, we give them credit for. So what we decided to do as a PTSO was to purchase a program called Character Strong. I'm such a skeptical person. It's why looking for the silver lining during this pandemic has been critical to my survival, because I tend to be like, oh, we don't need another program. The quality of teaching is right at your fingertips. Come on, we got this. So I was very, very skeptical. But as I said earlier with PACs, anything that you can afford that's going to make your life easier, Character Strong does that. So you can Google it, and a lot of their resources are free right now. And they actually have just created 16 new modules that are virtual and hybrid. And there's a little icon that you can click on that shows you how to do the lesson in person. And then you click on it again, it turns to a little monitor and it shows you how to do it virtually. And they are modules to address social and emotional learning that is very easy. I will tell you, I will leave you with a little embarrassment that happened to me when I was in the training to test out Character Strong. Relationship building and some of the rounds that you would do in a restorative circle that will be hard to do virtually, but that will be critical for you to do virtually, because how else will you make relationships with your students that you're not seeing every day in person? You'll have to spend time on relationships. So they have all these little rounds of questions that you can ask that are interactive, that feel a lot like the rounds of community building questions you might ask in a restorative circle. So in this meeting with tons of people, I get picked to do the first round of questions, which was a virtual deck of cards. They call it Deck of Destiny. And they asked me what card, what suit, and what number card I wanted. And I think I said two of hearts. I was trying to be less skeptical. I picked hearts. And I said, when the card came up, the question was, what song do you know every word to, all the words to? And I said, I like big butts. So I don't know why I said that, but I said that out loud in front of people from all over the country that were participating. And I do know a frighteningly large amount of words from that song, no pun intended. And so there's funny ways, especially if you've gotten to a place where you can be vulnerable. And if you're vulnerable, you know your students will be twice as likely to be vulnerable with you. So Character Strong is what we've chosen to do to support staff. It is a program created for teachers by teachers, and each lesson is built into Google Slides. And so as a teacher, it takes about 8 seconds if you're just going surface level, and up to 60 minutes if you want to go deeply with students. And I just saw the chat. That's hysterical. Thank you for that. You make me feel a little better. So it's worth looking into. If not that, something, I strongly encourage you all to have some sort of social emotional platform for you and for your students. And the last thing I'll say about it, and then I'll give one more brief moment to any other questions, is part of Character Strong is they have character dares. So this, and I try them out on my younger daughter who's 17 to see if they work at the high school level, because high school kids and teachers are so skeptical. When I say Character Strong, they're like, ugh. And I'm like, no, 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 it's actually high school based. The founder was a high school teacher, but it's also great at the elementary level and everything in between. And so it's the character dare is a dare for the week that, so like one of them is do something kind at least 3 times every day this week without being told. And of course, the high school kid was like, I took out the garbage and my mother didn't even have to ask me. And she was annoyed. And she's like, what do you want? And so then, you kind of come back to the high school student and say, well, how many other times have you taken out the trash without being asked? Well, that was the first time. Okay, so she's skeptical that you're not, that maybe you want money or something. That's why you're taking out the trash. I bet if you did that every time without being asked, or as many times as you could without being asked, she'll begin to recognize that. And that's a kindness. And we don't always get paid back for our kindness, do we? No good deed goes unpunished is a saying for a reason. But getting the kids weekly to think about this character dare. So there's also admin dares, and I'm doing them with my staff. So we did a bingo board of self-care, and if they created bingo and did the different things for self-care, there were prizes. I have a snack cart coming and coupons for them to purchase snacks, not purchase because I'm buying them, but you know what I mean, to redeem the coupons for snacks, different things. And so some of the admin dare, one of the things was every staff gave their most empowering song. And then we had guess whose song it was. One of the songs was The Bitch Is Back. Like some of the songs you can decide if you don't want explicit or not, but I said go for it because it was just for adults. And then we guessed each other's song, and there were like little incentives for that. So I strongly suggest, if you're not already using a platform, to research one. And if you want more information about the one I discussed, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you so, so much. Amanda, do you have anything for the good of the order?
There was just one last question about the red, green, and yellow card system, and whether or not you're familiar with that and whether you think it's a positive strategy.
I do not. I am very familiar with it, very familiar with the stoplight. However, what I'll say about it, I don't like the shame part that can be built into it. I don't like the clip charts either. And responsive classroom, quite frankly, every teacher that I've ever worked with that's replaced that with responsive classroom has resoundingly said they no longer needed it. They no longer needed a clip chart or a red, green, yellow. Be clear with your expectations, reinforce your expectations, support the teaching and learning that goes around your expectations. What I will say though is if you needed some type of system to indicate or to remind a student or redirect a student, if they're on red or they're on yellow and you don't reteach and reset and give them a chance to exhibit the behaviors you're looking for, they're always going to be on red. And so it's the same criticism PBIS has that we started with. PBIS celebrations often work for the audience we're not targeting, right? Like, so the student who pretty much always behaves and rarely, flips their card, PBIS works beautifully for. But what about the student who's always going to be on red? They get this reputation, like, the other kids are, ooh, you're on red, the behavior card. So I do believe, and whoever you are, if you want to email me, I'll give you more information about responsive classroom too, if you wanted to go in that direction, and about logical consequences and what that reteaching looks like. But red can't be the consequence because red doesn't come with instruction unless you by design make it that way. I hope that answers the question. And I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you so, so much. And feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. This was weird because I didn't get to talk to any of you or do the back and forth that I would normally do. So if you need some back and forth, feel free.
Alrighty. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your conferences, folks. Thank you. Amanda, do you want me to stay on for a second?
No, I think we're okay. I will open the next session like 15, 20 minutes early and text you when I'm doing it.
At 3.
Yep.
Am I right about that? I got one more and it's at 3 o'clock.
Correct.
Okay. What do you think I should do more of or less of or different?
I was surprised that we didn't get more input in the box, so maybe we could just take a little bit more time to give them time to respond to some of the prompts in the chat, and just maybe be more specific about when we want them to put input into the chat. But other than that, I thought everything went really well.
So maybe, do you want to give that direction at the top end to say, I want to go over the chat feature and discuss its use for this presentation, and then I'll try to be better about saying, this is a time for you to input the chat.
The chat, yep. And I think I also failed to say that if anybody would like to ask a question, just fire it out in the chat at any time. So I'll add that as well.
We live and learn. Hopefully, if they really do have lingering questions, I don't mind them emailing me because I'm pretty passionate about some of the information that I gave them. I hate red, green, and yellow. And I even started to do like this variation where we did like frogs on a lily pad. And it's like you got off the lily pad and you went into this other little spot for a second so that you could get back on the lily pad. And I thought, all right, well, that's better because at least the implication is if you make a mistake, you get back on the lily pad like everybody else. But there was still the shame component.
Yes.
I was reading about Brene Brown and I'm like, we're doing that every day. Can we stop doing that? So hopefully the folks that had strong questions around them will ask me. But if you hear anything or just let me know as well. And otherwise I'll see you a little before 3.
Cool. All righty. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.